Thank you, François. Thanks very much for the invitation to come to this very nice event. I've been learning a lot. Yeah, I had mobility in the title first, but I took it out because there's only a few mentions of mobility here, really. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm the last person standing between you and lunch. So let's move quickly. This is the outline of the talk. I want to start a little bit similarly to how Jean-Philippe started, even though the rest of the talk will be quite different, by asking what development is for. Then I'll talk a little bit about concepts and measurement in inequality of opportunity, give you a flavor of data and evidence on those things, and come back to some normative questions before concluding. So, I was, when I looked at the agenda for the workshop, I was sure that I wasn't going to be the first person asking, what is this all for? Yesterday we talked a lot about growth, but already Stefan Claassen reminded us in the panel yesterday that that's not the end, the objective, it's a means. Gary talked about, the objective of development is improving material living standards. And Jean-Philippe just now reminded us of Sen and everything. So I just had an initial slide here to say that, societies have thought about the objectives of development in very different ways. In the 17th and 18th century, people thought that a state's objective was to maximize the trade surplus, which, was subsequently much discredited, but that was the view at the time. Most of us grew up and studied under a view heavily influenced by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and others, which is still kind of the fundamental benchmark, the default program for economists, which is that the idea of development is to maximize average living standards. This differs a little bit from what Gary was talking about because Gary didn't have the word average in there. But when we look at growth in GDP per capita and those things, that's really what's in the back of our minds. Of course, more recently, but not even that recently anymore, 40 years ago or more, people started pointing out that, of course, there's more to development than that. Nozick thought that outcomes weren't the main thing you should use to measure how a society does. That processes matter, that liberties matter. Liberties were fundamental in John Rawls's theory of justice. Rawls also was concerned not only with liberties as the first principle, the first principle was this, the most extensive liberties consistent with similar liberties for others, but he had in a sort of lower hierarchical place in his thinking the idea of opportunities for office and other desirable things in his second principle, and he talked about primary goods and was concerned with distribution and said that the only condition under which inequality should be acceptable is that if that inequality was to the benefit of the lowest advantage or the least advantage in society. With Sen, we've already heard about talking about capabilities and functionings. Development as freedom. John Romer has a recent paper just come out where he talks of economic development as opportunity equalization, and that may go a little further than we want today, but I wanted to bring this up because when we talk about policies and policy interventions, that presupposes in some sense that we know what the social objective is, right? And yet we spend relatively little time thinking about those things. I think most of us tend to think about policy discussions in terms of correcting some market failure, but those market failures are failures with respect to something, vis-a-vis something, and that something is typically Pareto efficiency. It's the first welfare theorem, that the competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. Pareto efficiency is a very utilitarian concept. We all talk about poverty reduction. At the World Bank, this is some sort of, this is the policy objective in a sense. Now there are two. The other one is promoting shared prosperity, which has been defined in a very specific way. But mainly we think about the objective as being poverty reduction, which, implies really, if that's the objective, it implies that we have no concern for well-beings above the poverty line. And even if, that's kind of a difficult, I think, position to hold, conceptually, but even if you were to hold it, just the practical point that, as Stefan Claassen has reminded us, we don't even actually know exactly where the poverty line should be. So that's one reason not to focus only on the reduction of poverty. So post-utilitarian conceptualizations of development objectives have moved broadly in two directions. One is expanding the basal space, so this idea that we care about more than just incomes, and we just heard about other things we care about, women's rights and freedoms, freedom of choice and decision-making, references to the multidimensional poverty discussion that we had earlier also point to that expansion of the basal space. That's one direction. The other direction is a concern for distribution. So utilitarianism in its pure form is, as Sen said, supremely unconcerned with distribution, and people have been moving towards having some concern for distribution. The question, though, that arises there is distribution of what? Now we are back in a world where we're all talking about distribution of income and wealth after Thomas Piketty's book, but there was a lot of discussion for a long time about whether that was the right thing to focus on when you're thinking about a normative objective. Is the society that we want one in which there is zero inequality of income? And if it's not, how much inequality of income do we want? Is there an optimal amount of inequality of income? So, people thought about this for a long time. Amartya Sen, in his Tanner lectures in 1980, the lectures were entitled Equality of What? So he was thinking about the space in which we should be looking for equality in society. So in this talk, I'm not really going to talk at all about the expansion of the basal space, although it's important. But I'll focus very much just on the second direction of extension, this idea of equality of what. And in particular, I'm going to argue that some work's been done recently on the definition and measurement of inequality of opportunity may make it a useful concept for development economists to assess social progress and economic development, and also to assess the performance in some cases of individual policies. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. What is inequality of opportunity? Many people in this room know this very well, but not everyone may. First, it's a concept that has a philosophical lineage. Probably goes back before these people, but Ronald Dworkin, Richard Arnson, Jerry Cohen, John Romer, who's an economist bordering on a philosopher, have all talked about the concept of equality of opportunity. And as Jerry Cohen says, it's kind of becoming, for many of them, the right currency, the right space in which to think about egalitarian justice. Some economists in the early 90s also became interested in this and brought to it a sort of formal definition that's become the main workhorse for economists in this area now. And that definition is based on the distinction between two kinds of factors that affect outcomes for people. So if we think of outcomes as whatever you want to care about, could be income, could be education, could be health status, right? Think of that as your advantage variable. Then the key distinction that people introduced was one between factors that you do not control, like circumstances, and typically so they're called circumstances. So typically circumstances will include things like your race or ethnicity, your gender, your family background, where you were born, the parents you had, how rich the household was in which you grew up, and so on. And then other variables over which you exert some control, perhaps not full control, but over which you exert some control, are thought of as efforts. And the basic message for inequality of opportunity was that, okay, if we think of circumstances as morally irrelevant because they're predetermined and individuals have no control over them, then one way of thinking of equality of opportunity is when the distribution of advantage is independent of circumstances. Okay? So a quote here from my colleague and co-author Vito Peragine says, according to opportunity egalitarian ethics, economic inequalities due to factors beyond individual responsibility are inequitable and should be compensated by society, whereas those inequalities due to personal responsibility are okay and not to be compensated. Okay. An illustration of that, this is, we have a lot of Turkish examples today, and I think it's a coincidence that we have Danny here. But, so this is school enrollment in Turkey by gender and mother's education. On the upper diagram we have girls, on the bottom diagram we have boys. The three curves are, so in that case up there, girls by the education of their mother. So in black you have the girls whose mothers had no schooling, no formal schooling, then the mothers with primary schooling, and then above the mothers with secondary or higher schooling. And the same for boys here. So just to, on the horizontal axis we have age, and on the vertical axis we have the enrollment rate. So take 15 years of age. I should have a pointer, it would be easier. But if you have 15 years of age, at 15 years of age, boys whose parents had secondary or higher education basically are 100% enrolled. Whereas girls, if you look at the black line on the top, girls at 15 years of age, the girls whose mothers had no education, only about a quarter of them to a third are enrolled. Okay, so these are things. You do have a pointer. Thank you. Germans are typically very well equipped, and Stefan is not an exception to that. So I was talking about that there. Thank you very much. All right. That was an illustration of this concept that equality of opportunity is seen as a situation in which outcomes that we care about, like income, say, are distributed in a way that is independent of circumstances. So I want to talk a little bit about how we've gone about to try to measure that. And for that, I have a very little bit of notation. So think of a population as consisting of n agents that are characterized by three things. That's the important thing. The three things that people have is one advantage variable. Okay, so let's think of it as income, but in some cases I will actually show examples for education. Then there's a vector of circumstances. Okay, so these are the things you don't control. And then there's some efforts, which is whatever it is that you do control. And the basic, there are different approaches, but all of them follow on the basic framework, which is just simply to define what John Romer calls types, that is to say, groups of people who share the same circumstances. So this is some absurdly and strictly unnecessary formalism to say, define a partition where people have the same circumstances. Okay, so that's all it is. So if there are only two circumstances, gender, men and women, and race, black and white, then there would be four types. Right? Black men, black women, white women. Of course, if you introduce things like family background, where you were born, and so on, that could become a much broader partition. The key thing is to think of a type as a set of people with homogeneous circumstances. Okay? Then, within that, on the basis of that very simple partition, people have developed a number of different ways of trying to measure this concept. There are two main ones that I want to talk briefly about today. One, the ex ante approach, is one in which inequality of opportunity is basically seen as the inequality in the value of the opportunity sets that types face. So an advantage of this is that you don't have to measure effort, okay, but you do need to value the opportunity sets. Another approach, which is the one actually Romer follows, is ex post approach, measures inequality of opportunity as inequality amongst people who exert the same degree of effort. And I'll explain that a little bit more as I go through, but you can see the names ex ante and ex post refer to the idea that as though it would, ex ante means before the realization of effort levels. So you just look at types and you measure their opportunities in some sense and you compute that as your measure of inequality of opportunity. In the other one, you look at them after, so to speak, people have exerted effort. And then you look at the people who, in different types, have exerted the same effort, and you say they should have the same outcome. Okay? That's the justification here, or the argument. So let's start actually with the ex post formulation. And here let me have a very quick quote from John Romer. So in his 98 book, he says, leveling the playing field means guaranteeing that those who apply equal degrees of effort have the same achievement regardless of their circumstances. So if you're working 11 hours very hard, I don't know where Gary is anymore, but if you're working, there he is. If you're working 11 hours very hard rolling your cigarettes, and you're ended up rolling cigarettes because of where you were born and who you were and your gender and your parents and your country you were born in, and I'm working 11 hours at the World Bank and we're both putting in the same degree of effort, we should end up having the same achievements, which clearly we don't. Okay? So then he says, well, actually he thinks the centile of the effort distribution of one's type provides a meaningful intertype comparison of the degree of effort expended, in the sense that the level of actual effort does not. let me not dwell too much on that because we don't have time, but I can come back to that in questions. But what that means formally, he never wrote this, but what it means if you were to write it is that if you look at the distribution, the quantile function, the income at type K, of someone in type K at percentile pi should be the same as the income of someone in type L at percentile pi. Now that just says the quantile function should be equal. And of course, quantile functions are just the inverse of the distribution functions. So actually, what Romer is talking about is equality of opportunity as if you look at the distributions of income, for example, across types, that they should be the same. That would be the definition. Mind you, it doesn't mean no inequality. There can be inequality within types, but there would not be any inequality between types. So this says equality of opportunity is when these distributions are lying on top of each other. And of course they don't. So here's an example of them not lying on top of each other. These are distributions of per capita household consumption in 5 Latin American countries, again by mother's education. So here are, these, for those of you who, most of you are familiar with these things, these are just cumulative distribution functions, right? So if Romer were right, the distribution of people whose mothers have no primary schooling, incomplete primary schooling, or primary complete schooling should lie on top of each other. And they don't. And there's no causality here. There's no saying that these distinctions are due to mother's education. They're just circumstances that these people don't control. They don't control their mother's education. And so if there were equality of opportunity, it shouldn't matter, and yet it does dramatically. There's first-order dominance in most of these cases. Now, that's a very demanding approach, and it's this ex post approach I talked about of looking at people exerting different degrees of effort. A weaker approach comes from this ex ante view, where we try to somehow value opportunity sets. Now, one simple way in which that has been done in the literature, going back to Dirk van der Gaar's PhD thesis, and many others have used it since, is to think of the support of the distribution. So, that income line over there, here it's in logs and detrended from the mean, so it doesn't have anything. But think of the possible sets of incomes that people could reach, or of educational achievements, or of health status. Think of that as the opportunity set, okay? And value it by some number. It could be the equally distributed equivalent income of Tony Atkinson, or it could be just the mean, okay? So if we define the mean of income for a certain type as the value of that opportunity set, as an indicator for that, then a weaker criterion for equality of opportunity follows, which would define equality of opportunity as equality in the values of the opportunity sets. Right? Now, if you took that to be the mean, then this becomes a very simple exercise of measuring inequality now, not in the full distribution of incomes, but in what James Foster and Anton Schneyerhoff called the smooth distribution of income. That is, the distribution where you replace people's individual incomes with the incomes of their types. So if you have two types here, right, from Denis down and from Denis up is a different type, then I just give each of you the mean income here, those people above the mean income there, and we compute the inequality in that. And you could do that as the level of inequality, or you could do it as a share of total inequality. If this index of inequality satisfies the basic axioms, the basic principles of inequality measurement. And if we wanted that to be also to satisfy this other little technical axiom here of path-independent decomposability, you'd end up actually using the mean log deviation, which is what we do in the exercise here. Now, in the literature, people have done this in 2 different ways. You can do it just non-parametrically by computing the tile index for that, the mean log deviation for that. Sometimes you have too many circumstances. If you have too many circumstances, you're dividing a sample into very small little bits, and you run into problems of data availability. You've got very noisy estimates of the means for each type, so you can do it parametrically, and it works as well. The point I want to raise here is that in both cases, there is a serious issue of interpretation, and that is that if you take this ex ante approach, you're likely to be observing a strict subset of the circumstances you'd like to observe. So there are other things, if you take things like parents' education, place of birth, race, gender, those are all clearly circumstances. They're things people don't control. But there are other things they don't control that you don't observe. 10, okay, that's good. So if that's the case, omitted circumstances can only lead to a finer partitioning of the set, right? And so in both cases, both for the parametric and the non-parametric, the estimates that we have are lower bound estimates of inequality of opportunity, okay? A second implication is that if you do it through the parametric way, and omitted circumstances are a significant problem, which they almost always you will be, there can be no causal attribution to specific variables. What you have is simply a lower bound measure of the total impact of circumstances on inequality. And this slide is just a very simple visual sketch of the proof for that. Suppose you had two circumstances. You know, parental education can take 3 levels, and race can take three categories. So you have 9 types. Now suppose I also suddenly observe gender. Okay, so here I have education of the parent and I have occupation. If I suddenly in my data set observe gender, that just breaks each of those cells into more cells. Between group inequality here can only be higher than here. It cannot be lower. Okay, so that's a very simple point, but what it says is that whatever measures we have are lower bound measures of inequality of opportunity. So a very brief summary of what these ex ante and ex post approaches are, using a little diagram that I like. So this is a quantile function, so it's the inverse of the distribution function. So what we interpreted here is these are the poorest people in each type to the richest people in each type. This is the quantile function. It tells you what the income is for those poor people or rich people. Okay, so it tells you what the income is for people living in each of these percentiles. And the 3 colors are 3 types, okay? So how do we aggregate the inequality of opportunity? How do we measure the inequality of opportunity in a society like that when we have these types of their different incomes? Well, the ex ante approach just look at the means and calculates inequality on that. The ex post approach looks at each trench, as the people have called it, at each level of effort, at each centile, and calculate inequality in those and aggregate it in some way. Okay, so let me show you some data and evidence. This illegible slide here just lists 8 studies from each in a little survey paper that we've done with Paolo Bronari and Vito Peragine. We looked at these studies, and the point of this slide here is just to show that actually there's a lot of differences in them. You know, they come from very different data sources. Some use per capita income, some use consumption. Some estimates are parametric, some are non-parametric. The number of types are very different. In other words, I'm about to do something I really shouldn't do, which is compare them. Okay, so you now have been warned that you should take this comparison with enormous amount of salt because they come from very different things. And what I'm going to do in the next few slides very briefly is show you a bunch of pictures. And the point is just to show that there is something in this data, however imperfect, even though we don't observe the circumstances we'd like to, even though we know there are lower bounds, even though there are differences, you know, there's some stuff in there. For example, the range of these numbers, these are IORs, so they are relative measures of inequality of opportunity. They are inequality of opportunity. The lower bound on what proportion of total inequality in these societies is accounted for, but something that's clearly circumstances. Clearly people don't control them. Race, gender, parental education, and so on. And they range from, you know, about 2 or 3% in Norway to about a third in Guatemala and Brazil, using income. If I use consumption for Guatemala, it goes up to 50%. But I don't have it here because where I had income, I put income. The orange lines, which are for African countries, actually all come from a paper that Denis and his co-authors wrote. You know, here's one issue where comparability is a problem because he had a very small number of types, typically, given the data that he had. So it's quite possible that for those African countries, those numbers would be quite a bit higher. The yellow line for Turkey is from a paper that I did with some co-authors. And it's yellow because it uses a different concept of, it uses wealth indices from the DHS, so it's a different thing. Now, you know, once you've got a few points of data, it's irresistible to make scatter plots. So here are some scatter plots. This is inequality of opportunity against GDP per capita. Okay, so you've got this little Kuznets curve here that I won't read anything into, but it's there and statistically significant. Then there are some correlations which I think are interesting. Here's the correlation of inequality of opportunity and income inequality. Notice this measure here is a ratio of inequality of opportunity over the total, so there's no mechanical correlation here. So it suggests that with significance, there's some association, again, no causality, there's some association between the degree to which an economy is income unequal and the degree to which that economy is opportunity unequal, in the sense that a larger share of that is due to things people don't control, okay? So if you think of inequality of opportunity as something close to mobility, which we don't have time to discuss very much, then this would become an analog to what Miles Korak, to a curve that Miles Korak created, and which Alan Kruger, in a speech in America, baptized the Great Gatsby curve, which some of you may have heard about, and a lot of people talk about it now. When you have mobility here, the curve says more mobile societies tend also to be more unequal, which is kind of interesting in the American debate, because you may remember that Milton Friedman very famously argued that more inequality was not necessarily a bad thing if a society was also more mobile, because inequality was just today, but tomorrow our roles will be reversed. Now, it turns out that more unequal societies are also those that are least mobile, at least looking at the short run. So Paul Collier and I were briefly talking at coffee break about some work by Gregory Clark, which suggests that such a relationship may not exist if you look at the very long run. But be that as it may, this is how you have it here with inequality of opportunity and income inequality. This is another measure I don't have time for. Let me move straight away to this, which is I wanted to come back to my initial question of what development is for. And say that in the literature on inequality of opportunity, people like John Romer and Dirk van der Gaar have thought a little bit about it, and they had said, okay, well, what policy role should people choose to promote equality of opportunity? And they, following Rawls as well a little bit, said, well, we should, John says we should find a policy that makes the people in each type, that makes the people at each percentile in each type better off. So basically, John Romer wants to get, oops, wrong direction. John Romer's policies would be the ones that would raise the lower envelope of this thing, right? But he says, if I want a single policy, the policy that's best for these people may not be the policy that's best for these people, so I'm going to take an average of that to get a single policy, and so that's the average across the means. In the ex ante approach, basically you take the mean first, so you just change the order, because you're trying to do what? You're trying to maximize the welfare of the lowest type measured by its mean, okay? Now, those things struck us as, for one thing, very static and very unconcerned with with growth and development. So in a now oldish paper that we wrote with François and Mike Walton, we attempted to do a little bit more to this by incorporating dynamics, incorporating some form of aversion to inequality of outcomes as well, and incorporating the issue that there are individual freedoms that matter, and these things matter. So what we have here is basically, first of all, not a level of income, but a present discounted value of income for the lowest type, okay? And so this says, let's choose the policy from a set phi, okay, that maximizes the future stream of advantage for the most disadvantaged type, subject to a constraint that says every individual I at time t in group T should be above a minimum level, okay, and to a policy choice constraint. So here's deconstructing that policy for us. So first of all, moving from a static level to a present discounted value says that growth matters. We are in societies that are very poor. We are in societies where, we'd like to think of this dynamic process as well. So, for example, if choosing Cuban-style socialism would equalize incomes today, but mean that over the long term, the poorest people will not be growing as fast as if they had some alternative system, then maybe we don't want to do that. So we want to look at efficiency and growth when we're thinking about this, but we want to look at what it will do for the lowest type, for the most disadvantaged type. So there's still a Rawlsian criterion here, okay? By imposing that constraint, we're actually placing a priority on poverty eradication. We're saying whatever we do to maximize the well-being of the lowest type, we must do so in a way that nobody is left completely behind. That deals to some extent with a criticism that Ravi Kambur often makes of this, which is, okay, so you see some very, very poor person sitting in a slum in Delhi or whatever, and drinking, and maybe you say, well, it's a little bit his own fault. But are you just going to leave them there? So there's an element of compassion, there's an element that goes beyond opportunities that you want to incorporate. You can do it in many ways. One of them is to set it as a constraint, that nobody will be below a certain amount. That moves poverty eradication from an objective to a constraint, okay? Now, one thing I like a lot is actually this set phi here. This is the policy set. Now, typically people think of that as just the feasible policy set. What can a government do given the resources at its disposal? But we interpret it also as a set of other restrictions on policy that come from a commitment and a respect to individual liberties and freedoms. So, for example, as I always like to say to my students, and some of my former students are in the room, they may remember this, I used to say, look, if I really want to reduce inequality, one thing I can do is I can just force you guys to go and marry people who are very, very poor, okay? Because that'll eliminate assortative mating. It'll reduce inequality in a very efficient way. But we don't believe society should work like that, right? We don't believe that we want to impose that rule because there's certain freedoms we don't want to mess with. So that, in a sense, a little bit is a way in which we think of these inequality of opportunity framework in the context of economic development. Let me skip this application, for which I have no time, and just say a couple of words by way of conclusion. First, let me say something about what inequality of opportunity really is. It's a core minimum of inequality that's clearly inconsistent with social justice. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about inequality in incomes beyond that. You can if you want, but this kind is the really bad. I like to use the analogy of cholesterol. Inequality comes in many types, just like cholesterol comes in 2 types. There's bad inequality and possibly less bad inequality, and the really bad inequality is this kind, okay? Even that minimum depends on a decision that's ultimately a social and political decision on what should count as circumstances. If you think that everybody has, a single DNA, right, a single set of genes, then at some level everything is circumstances, and you don't want to go that far. The concept loses its meaning if you go that far. There must be a role in this framework for free choice. There must be a role for some degree of genuine effort that people are making. So you must decide where do you stop the boundary on circumstances, okay? I think I've already said it's consistent with giving priority to certain individual freedoms that policies can protect. It can be meaningfully measured. There's a real big range in the values that we have found so far, according to different countries. And finally, economists, some economists at least, have begun to think of this inequality of opportunity variable as a meaningful variable. So some people have investigated the relationship between inequality of opportunity, this kind of bad cholesterol inequality, and economic growth. There's this paper by Marrero and Rodriguez in the JDE, which I've put the figure here now that I don't have time to go over. But what it finds is that looking at PSID data for the United States, it finds that states where inequality based on race and parental education, computed exactly as I described, so inequality of opportunity in each state using race and parental education as circumstances, is negatively associated with subsequent growth, whereas overall inequality is not. Okay? We've tried to do that looking at the world. We find no robust results at all, so I'm a bit skeptical, but anyway, that's fine. Other people have actually looked at the impact of certain policies, using impact evaluation techniques on inequality of opportunity. As a last word, one key challenge I think going forward, and sometimes people ask me, have you tried to sort of interject this kind of idea into the debate, for example, on the post-2015 goals and so on? And I haven't, in part because nobody has asked me to, but in other part because one big challenge is comparability of data. So we've heard from Stefan Klassen on how hard it is to just compare poverty across countries. To compare inequality of opportunity, you need not only comparable data on incomes and advantages, but also on circumstances. And those are just not in the data to a large extent. The household surveys don't ask questions about them to the extent that we would like. So that's something I think where we need to do a little more work. So let me stop there. Thank you.